Now for MiG Alley, that wide band of airspace over northwest Korea infested by the enemy jets. Our F-86s had this great advantage over the Russian-built MiGs. They were better handled. Simply as aircraft, the MiGs were at least the equal of the F-86s, and the enemy had a lot of them. They usually outnumbered the F-86s, sometimes by as much as 3 or 4 to 1. But our pilots were much more skillful than theirs. This was the big reason that we destroyed 8 times as many of their fighters as they did of ours. During the entire war, 827 MiGs were down. We lost 112 jet aircraft in air-to-air combat.
Tiger lead, Tiger 2 here. I got a couple of bogeys out there. One coming around at 2 level. Roger, boy, I got him. All right, there he goes. He's going down. You got him? All right, boy, that's a good deal. Watch it. We got 4 of them coming in here on us at 7 o'clock. Hang on. I haven't got him. Go ahead, take it, and I'll cover you. All right, I'm going in now. Okay, he's down, boy. You got him, too.
Before it was the dread of Korean skies and famous with MiG Alley, the North American F-86 Sabre faced another nemesis. The sound barrier was invisible, formless, and made of air. In October 1947, the rocket-powered Bell X-1 attempted to break this wall over Muroc Dry Lake in the sun. However, history often has an unofficial script. Test pilot George Welch, who had shot down the first Japanese plane at Pearl Harbor, entered the prototype XP-86 cockpit on October 1. He drove the sleek silver machine during a test flight. Welch saw the airplane shake severely as the airspeed indicator approached Mach 1, as if an unseen hand were trying to pull it apart. Despite the tremendous buffeting, he persisted. Suddenly, the shaking stopped. Suddenly, controls were smooth. From the ground, the engineers heard a boom, a clear sky thunderclap, something they had never heard from an airplane in flight. George Welch and the XP-86 are still famous as the first thunderclap of a new age, even though Chuck Yeager and the X-1 broke the sound barrier 2 weeks later. Not simply a speed record, but a proclamation. It showed that this aircraft, with its German-inspired swept wings, was the future of flight. Gunpowder smoke and contrails over Korea would soon write its future. The history of jet-powered fighters begins before the Second World War. The British Gloucester Meteor was the first Allied jet fighter operational. The Meteor planned to raise fighter speeds from the existing 400 miles per hour limit to perhaps 500 using 2 centrifugal flow engines. These Meteors originate in Europe right before the Second World War ends. Given that the United States Air Force lacked an equivalent in service at the time, the American airmen clearly found them highly interesting. The Meteor saw very little fighting overall, being confined in England because of the concern that the new technology would find its way into enemy hands. Still, it was quite helpful for intercepting the V-1 weapon fired against Britain, where its enormous speed proved quite advantageous, given that Germany was at least 1 year ahead of British jet design and actually flew jet-powered aircraft prior to the war. The British worry that the Meteor might fall into German hands was somewhat of a paradox. A young German pilot is given some last-minute guidance here before his first jet flight. Unquestionably, this plane, the Messerschmitt 26-2, an amazing aircraft driven by two axial flow jet engines, which actually made it quicker than the Meteor, was the Luftwaffe's most successful aircraft. It also used a good aerodynamic form. The following models were meant to use a swept-wing philosophy, which German engineers were also developing, though many of them were committed to a bomber mission, in which the Swallow, as it became known, was by no means best used. Over 1,500 262s were actually manufactured on Hitler's personal insistence. The German High Command later, first informally, let the 26-2 be deployed as a fighter. The 26-2's terrible speed wreaked havoc among Allied bombers in the brief period it was utilized in the fighter capacity. Sadly for the Germans, the 206-2 arrived only too late to preserve the Third Reich, but it did provide the Allies with another view on the prospects of jet development. America did not begin developing jet technology until 1943. However, had the war gone on, the outstanding Lockheed Shooting Star would have been its first combat jet, concentrating more on upgrading piston engine design. Though the fundamental fighter seen for many years was very much the same, this is a photo reconnaissance version. With a thin, streamlined body and more powerful jet engines, the Republic Thunderjet presented still more advancement. But both the P-80 and the P-84 used the straight-wing design, which essentially matched the forms utilized in World War II quite closely. For its first jet, the North American Aviation Company also used a typical straight-wing layout. But they immediately after the war acquired access to the data on German swept-wing technology, therefore changing the wing and tailplane arrangement into a swept-back configuration. As it came to be known, the P-86 Sabre also included many other sophisticated elements such as powered air brakes, automated slats on the wing, and an all-moving tailplane. However, most importantly of all, its characteristics were the sweeping surfaces, which lowered air resistance and hence allowed greater speeds. Fundamentally, the P-86 was a General Electric J-47 jet engine using the axial flow concept, akin to those employed in the previous German Me-262, but much more advanced and sophisticated, based on the idea of air being sucked in from the air intake on the aircraft's nose. The jet concept flowed into an axial flow compressor region, where the air was progressively compressed via 12 separate stages. It is then driven into the combustion chambers, where atomized fuel is injected to ignite the mixture. The resultant combustion and expansion of exhaust gases both generate the required thrust and drive the compressor. So the cycle keeps on. Ground crew members also had to learn about the thrust generated by jet engine technology. Fear that the amazing blast might cause personnel to get sucked in and at the rear of the jets meant no-go areas were declared in front of the engine intake. One issue that jet engines had over piston aircraft was that they burned enormous amounts of fuel, and in a limited area, such as a fighter's fuselage, every square inch of available space is dedicated to this all-important commodity. Like many other aircraft, the Sabre used drop tanks to supply additional kerosene. Standard armaments for most Sabres to enter production were 6 50mm machine guns, which were positioned on either side of the highly armored pilot's position, originally XP-86. The first prototype Sabre was ready for takeoff on October. The fuselage is clean, and the very simplified picture is produced by swept surfaces. For fighter pilots, the one-piece bubble canopy also provided the vital advantage of great visibility. Here no F-87. From Muroc, the first finished aircraft, using the previous J-35 engine, sets off. George Welsh sits at the controls. Based in Hawaii at the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Welsh flew a P-40 and was among the few pilots actually to launch a retaliatory attack. He distinguished himself by intercepting the first Japanese aircraft in the Second World War, and then worked throughout the F-86 test program as a test pilot. Although this is not the Sabre's actual first flight, it is interesting that the gear is down constantly, as on the first flight the gear was retracted, and lowering the nose wheel on the approach proved somewhat problematic. Welsh thus carried the aircraft nose high, and the main wheel's impact moved the nose gear into position. Sabre production was scheduled long before the first flight of the prototype. Mostly due to the benefits of the swept wing at high speed, the Sabre entered production on October 16, 1947, with an initial order of 33 F-86A and 90 F-86Bs. A pilot was entering a new universe the instant he pushed the external switch to run the motorized canopy. He would first look at the ejector seat locking pins once inside. These could not be taken out until just before taxiing to stop inadvertent shooting while the plane was still on the ground. The pilot would then consider the amazing range of controls and instrumentation fundamental to the new technology. Managing a Sabre was a significantly more complex job than merely the stick and rudder methods needed of pilots of previous aircraft. Here, 5,200 pounds of power had to be under control and directed to propel what at the time was the fastest aircraft in the world.
That's an F-86. In my opinion, it's the best airplane ever made.
It's like being in a real fine racehorse. And really, if somebody could show you how to start the engine, close the canopy, and pull up the gear, that's all the education you need to fly an 86.
If you get me an 86A, I'll fly.
It was a learning experience, kind of blind leading the blind. Most of us don't see it, never been in a jet airplane.
That's the one airplane that today, even with my poor vision and all, if I had an opportunity to fly, and my wife and his kids didn't know about it, I'd try.
Hit that auto start, I knew that was the airplane I needed to fly.
I know I could get it off the ground. I think I could get it down on the ground again, because it was a Cadillac of all the airplanes, and I must have flown 50 or 60 different airplanes in my career.
Building the required thrust to get the aircraft off the ground takes some time, which is one distinction between jet-powered and piston engines. For the bigger jet bombers, this was especially true. Even fighters had to develop their thrust before takeoff. Examining this photo closely reveals the automatic leading edge flaps opening, which would provide the pilot with additional low-speed control. A Sabre was, in every sense, a fighter pilot's aircraft, and its nimbleness and agility would pay off in the years ahead. The Sabre became the F-86 at this point, replacing the Air Force's P for Pursuit name, a more fitting F for fighter. The Air Force displayed the Sabre's performance in many public events in the late 40s and early 50s. Occasionally, as many as 80 aircraft would fly in complex formations, exhibiting aerial talents, though by then it was standard for the pilots. At these air shows, the breaching of the sound barrier was still a curiosity for the audience. Public confidence in American air power was crucial. Since the Soviets displayed a deadly mix, Russia had replicated American B-29 long-range bombers, which on a one-way trip could reach the United States. Worse, America lost its nuclear monopoly, and an atomic bomb exploded under its control. This, combined with a fast souring of the two countries' ties, caused serious worry. Production of Sabre was raised, and an all-weather variant was created to offset any Russian attack. That was the F-86D Sabre Dog. To find enemy bombers in all kinds of weather, including night, the aircraft used a powerful radar scanner positioned over the nose. Mounted in the fuselage, it also made use of a rack of unguided rockets, as their armaments were thought to be far more effective against attacking Russian bombers. When strife did arise, it was really in a far-off land. The United Nations intervened when North Korean troops invaded South Korea. United States B-29s were quickly sent to attack northern industries and communications. Although the United States essentially controlled the skies over Korea, the B-29 was not the most appropriate weapon for this task. Yet it performed rather well. Then American pilots were taken aback to find the first Russian-built MiG-15s on November These planes were far ahead of anything the Soviets were believed to have produced, and B-29s were no match for these fierce, stubby Soviet fighters, even with their defensive weaponry. The Pentagon dispatched F-86 to Korea in response to the danger, hence starting the MiG versus Sabre struggle.
As young lieutenants in Korea, flying against the MiG-15, the mystery for us always was, what is the real, true capability of this airplane? We knew the wings swept back, like a Sabre's wings, and we knew that they consistently flew higher than we did. We had all these questions about the MiG. Fortunately, later, after the war was over, actually, a young North Korean pilot named No Kum-suk defected with a MiG-15.
I landed in Kimpo Air Base in South Korea. Some people said the MiG-15 is better plane than the F-86. Those are not even flown either this plane or F-86 or MiG-15. And I told them that's untrue. Even papers said that MiG-15 is a better plane. Those who have never flown the plane. In fact, at news conference, they asked me which is a better plane. I said definitely F-86 is a better plane. I even told them that if I had a chance to fly F-86, I can shoot down any MiG, doesn't matter who flies.
And it was taken to Okinawa, and 2 of our test pilots flew it, and then they told us all about the MiG. Now at Hazy, when my friends from that era come to visit here, we go out and we look at the display. It shows the F-86 Sabre, and right next to it, there's a MiG-15. We can look at the 2 airplanes, compare the size, look at the various features, and it's a strange and marvelous feeling that comes over you to finally have the answers to all those questions we had as young lieutenants when our lives were at stake, depending on how much we knew about that airplane and what it could do.
The United States pilots had been exposed to MiG-15s on numerous successful operations by 1952, and as with the Second World War, a select group of aces materialized. Men have the ability and will to maximize their fighters' capacity against the opponent. Colonel Gabreski was one of the United States aces. After flying Thunderbolts during the Second World War, Gabreski arrived in Korea already a master. But his reputation as a MiG killer was to be improved still more. The American pilot's competence and experience were absolutely essential, as the MiG was by no means a poor aircraft. Although MiG kills were far more than Sabre losses, the MiG-15 was clearly a great aircraft in many respects and far more advanced than the Sabre. This made the Air Force highly eager to have their hands on a 15 to discover what worked. Later on in the fight, dropped pamphlets over enemy territory, offering enemy pilots $100,000 should they defect with their aircraft to the south. Lieutenant Rowe, one pilot, turned down the offer, and that saw a MiG-15 arrive at Kimpo on September 21, 1953. Must have been a really astonished ground crew indeed. Soon, American pilots, eager to fly the MiG to evaluate it for themselves, had the plane. The MiG's armaments, one 37mm and two 23mm cannon, were mounted in a small demountable unit that could be rapidly replaced by the ground crew, allowing the aircraft to turn about rather quickly. Since the borrowed MiG was acquired complete with ammo, it was feasible to test its firing power. 6 machine guns of the Sabre offer a faster rate of firing than aircraft bearing heavier cannons. Still, the cannon had far more hitting power. The armaments of the MiG inspired the United States to replace the 6 50mm machine guns with a mix of 4 20mm cannons for the Sabre. Though it arrived late in the Korean battle, the Sabre with cannons had some rather major issues. Although the United States had numerous MiG victories for most of the campaign, the machine guns, with their great rate of fire, would be the weapon used to down the MiGs. Pilots were instructed not to approach the adversary straight from behind, but rather slightly from the side, an angle that provided a larger fuselage surface to strike, maximizing possibilities. F-86s. The F-86s lacked things all their own way, given the quality of the MiG's design and the force of its weaponry. Still, the original Sabre design's quality and robust structure held it in fine shape. Many aircraft came home bearing amazing damage, but still flying. Much thanks for North America's workmanship. The Sabre's strong point was the thick armor it supplied for the pilots. This brought back many soldiers who would not have made it otherwise. Like the 86 in action, American aces were brought back to teach fresh pilots as the Korean conflict dragged out. The other part of the American formula which won the Korean air battle was this policy of experienced pilots passing on their abilities to new guys. The encounter might have had another result as the MiG was so equally matched with the Sabre in general ability under the hands of stronger pilots. The actual difference between the two planes was the higher competency and better training of the American pilots, which resulted in a corresponding higher skill. Suiting up was no simple thing for the pilot. First, he would be sporting a hefty flight suit, including a lined vest and the required .45 automatic, along with survival gear with everything from a rubber raft to a homing beacon. He also had to wear a Mae West life preserver, the basic parachute. He must have felt almost a natural part of the jet by the time he was seated in his Sabre, with helmet and breathing mask on. This was in some measure symbolic, as it was the union of man and machine that made United States fighters so successful throughout the Korean War. The Sabre's design provided for great adaptability in use. Although it was basically meant to be an interceptor, it may have air-to-ground rockets or possibly bomb carrying capability. This made it perfect for the interdiction function, although it was hardly deployed in Korea. Other nations in other theaters used the interdiction duty as ground attack aircraft. The Sabre 86 performs really brilliantly, just too late for the Korean conflict. The United States produced air-to-air target missiles, like the clever Sidewinder in the mid-50s, which fit Sabres to boost their interceptor capability. Here, fired from one side of an 86, a normal 5-inch unguided rocket is acting as a test target for the Sidewinder from the other side. Although the Sabre was constructed in Italy and Japan and built in Canada and Australia, Australia most certainly represents the most fascinating development. The Royal Australian Air Force needed a new Sabre, and the Commonwealth Aircraft Factory completely rebuilt, stretched, and strengthened the 86's fuselage to fit the same Avon engine running its Canberra bombers. Although using the bigger engine was no simple chore, This gave an engine with 50% more thrust than the early Sabre. Though its top speed was not much more than that of the American variant, the Australian Sabre was the most powerful, manufactured with far more acceleration and lifting capability. Like the Y used by American aircraft, the big letter P on the side of this jet is the usual Commonwealth symbol for prototype. The French Mirage replaced Australia's 1112 Avon-powered Sabres, several of which were handed to the Indonesian Air Force. The Sabre, still serving numerous nations, was beginning to age early though the adoption of Sidewinder missiles boosted its hitting power as an interceptor, no aircraft, not even the famed 86, could stay in frontline service permanently. In addition, North America had developed a successor in the form of the F-100 Super Sabre, bigger and capable of speeds of up to 1,000 miles per hour. Shown above next to an F-86 Sabre Dog, this is the first of the renowned Century series of American fighter aircraft. Early in the 1960s, the Sabres were sent increasingly to the Home Guard. Here, a pilot checks an 86 that has been assigned to the Home Guard. Once more, man and aircraft taken together are absolutely powerful. Neither the investment the country invested in such a well-manufactured and long-serving aircraft as the 86, nor the abilities and expertise of a combat veteran are lost to the country. Under the capable and committed aircrew of the Home Guard, the Sabre served as a second line of defense for many years following its replacement and frontline service. Originally flown by United States National Guard squadrons throughout the 1970s, the F-86 is still flown by air forces worldwide. And so, the story of the F-86 Sabre is far more than just cold metal and engine thrust. From a design conceived in the technological race of the 1940s, it proved astonishingly resilient. It wasn't simply built well. It answered the call when history demanded it, holding the line in the skies over Korea. It bridged the gap between eras, from the last of the classic dogfights to the dawn of a new age, becoming one of the world's first fighters operationally equipped with air-to-air missiles. But ultimately, its legacy is the bond between man and machine, a testament to the engineering, the craftsmanship, and the courage of the pilots who flew her. The Sabre didn't just serve its purpose, it became an icon. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into the legend of the F-86, please give this video a like. Let us know your thoughts on the Sabre in the comments below.